And you can see why those areas are available, because China is weak. Russia would like to expand, so would Japan. Basically, Russia and Japan get into a war because they're both expanding into the same areas. I mean, that's kind of what they do. It's kind of like two people get into a fight. You know, you guys get into a fight over Hazel's lunch because Hazel just walked out of the room, and you're like, I want her lunch. No, I want her lunch. Boom, boom, boom. Poosh. Yes.
What about Manchuria?
We'll tell you about that. Okay, you ready? So there's a couple of different areas we want to talk about. First, Korea, then we'll talk about Manchuria. You ready? First, Korea. Is Korea a separate, identifiable East Asian place and culture and language and thing? Yes. I mean, if somebody would go, oh, Korea, that's just part of China. Is that true? No, it's not. And yet, know this. Korea is connected by land closely to China. It's a big difference, say, than from Japan. Japan was never successfully invaded by China. Korea made a deal with China a long time ago. Basically, China kind of came in and said, hey, Koreans, we're thinking of conquering you. And the Koreans are like, we'll put up a fight. And the Chinese are like, we'll beat you. The Koreans are like, it's going to cost you. We're willing to. And then they came up with another idea. The Koreans are like, how about if we pay you our lunch money every year? I mean, tribute. That's what some countries do. The Koreans were in a position of, I want to say, almost 1,000 years of paying tribute to China. It works like this. You pay money to China, China leaves you alone. In fact, China kind of sort of protects you from other folks that are going to come and take you over. Right? So China is like the bodyguard. What does Korea get to maintain? Its own separate identity and develop its culture and language and so forth at the price of making annual payments. And that makes sense if China is strong. What did I tell you about China in the 1800s? Strong going up or going down? Going down. So Korea's like, why bother sending China anymore? I mean, like, this thing is falling apart. And then they're looking, and here comes Japan, and here comes Russia and everybody else, and it's like, yeah, write this down. Korea was pretty much taken over by Japan late in the 1800s. It was part of the Sino-Japanese War. China versus Japan. China lost. And so a lot of that Korean territory falls under, the end of the 1800s, yeah, a lot of that Korean territory falls under the control of Japan. Okay? Yeah. To the north of Korea is an area called Manchuria. Now, if you were to look at a modern map, Manchuria would be like northeast China. In fact, take a look at this modern map right here. We've got China, and this area, this big kind of area in the northeast part, that's known as Manchuria. So question, is it Chinese or not Chinese? It's part of China today. And at different times in history, it's been part of China, although a lot of times in history, not necessarily. What do you think of, some of you guys remember this from earlier studies, the northern border of China, protected by a great structure, along with Mulan and all of her garrisons to defend against invaders from the north. What is that structure? Yes? It's called the Great Wall of China. I'm going to build the wall along the north part. Well, where is the wall? In fact, it's just north of Beijing. All of Manchuria is north of the Great Wall of China. Because the Manchurians were seen as the Chinese as barbarian outsiders. And in fact, the government in China was Manchurian. The last Chinese dynasty was Manchurian. The Manchurians had invaded and conquered China in like the 1700s. Things weren't going so well for them by the time we get to the late 1800s. But yeah, the last one was Manchurian. So, because they invaded. It's like if you look at like Chinese history, look at all the different dynasties that come and go, sometimes you get a dynasty like the Mongols. When they conquered China, did they establish a Mongol dynasty? Yeah. And then eventually they got kicked out. Well, the Manchurians had invaded and conquered and so forth. As it turns out, though, China's having a hard time maintaining control over lots of different parts of China. And Japan and Russia are like looking at China and going, and Korea and going, we want that, we want that, we want that. And so much of this war is fought between Russia and Japan over areas of Korea and Manchuria. Okay? And who wins? And generally, why? Because Japan had gotten up their industrial capacity to win. Now, there's going to be some other facts on the ground and so forth about how this plays out, but that is a very important thing. Russia thought they could beat Japan. Turns out they couldn't, they didn't. It might have turned out differently, but here's an interesting thing that we look at. If all the fighting is going to take place here, which of those two countries is closest to the action? Russia or Japan? Which of them is in the best position to send ships and sailors and soldiers and so forth to the area of fighting? Japan is. Write that down. Now you're like, well, they're across the water here, but that's not that far to get your supplies and equipment and so forth in there. But actually, it's kind of confusing, though, because isn't Russia right there, too? Yeah, in your notes, you see Vladivostok? It's a Russian seaport. You can see it right here, Vladivostok. It's a Russian seaport on the Pacific. Where is the heart of Russian population and strength and whatever economy they have? It's over in the western part. Yeah, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Now, did they build some kind of like a train track to go from the western part all the way over to the eastern part? Yes, it's in your notes, the Trans-Siberian Railway. It was good that they built that, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to get anything over without a great deal of difficulty. But that's still going to be an advantage for the Japanese. Okay? All right. So we've laid out the location, Manchuria, Korea, Vladivostok. Oh, Port Arthur. Let's identify Port Arthur. Do you see it here on the map? That was a Chinese port that had come under the control of the Russians. Right? So the Russians have got some ships there, and they've got some control of that part of China. And you're like, what the heck? I mean, what was it like? We're like other countries in control of different parts of China? Hong Kong. Guess who got control of Hong Kong? British. The British held on to it for like 150 years until they had to hand it over to China not too long ago. And some of those people in Hong Kong are like, we like living under the British control because it allows us to practice things freely and elections and so forth. And some of those people aren't too happy right now because now the Chinese Communist government's like, yeah, no more. You're in China now. Port Arthur. Okay? Okay? And that's actually where the war is going to start. So who started the war? Well, I'll tell you this. Write this down. Before the war started, Russian and Japanese government officials are talking to each other about expanding. I mean, it happens sometimes, right? Instead of Abby and Gianna getting into a fight over Hazel's abandoned lunch, or maybe she hasn't abandoned it, maybe she's just not putting up enough of a fight, instead of getting into a fight, they negotiate and they decide, we're going to split it up between us. I mean, it happens sometimes. It's not very nice. But there were negotiations going on between Russia and Japan. It's very interesting because sometimes in history, negotiations end peacefully and there's an agreement. Other times, negotiations stop. Well, when do they stop? When one side, sometimes both sides are like, we have not agreed, and then both are like, I think war might be coming any moment. Sometimes one side is like, well, we're still negotiating, but then they start a war. Why would one side start a war when negotiations are still going on? Doesn't that sound sneaky? Which country started the Russo-Japanese War? Japan did. Okay? Yeah. Japan did. They started it on February 8th, 1904. The Japanese attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. They attacked. And they didn't declare war ahead of time. They waited until 3 hours after the attack. Oh my gosh, if you knew that historically, and you're like the year is December 1941, and Japan is like having a difficult time with the United States of America, is it possible that maybe Japan might do a sneak attack against us? Did they? Where? Pearl Harbor, what day? December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, and then they officially announced they were declaring war. Yes, Jenna? Yes, February 8th, 1904. The war begins when Japan attacks the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Yeah, it was a surprise attack. And then, boom, we're going to have war. We'll get into the details of how the war played out next time. Okay, we're at a good spot there. All right, good.